Cooper live.
Awesome. Oh, so my bad. So what's up, everybody? Welcome to today's weekly Pan-African News. My name is Rashad, and I am out of occupied Ute territory, or also known as Denver, Colorado. And this is my comrade, everyone's favorite person, Anya Sanu. And we're both members of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. And the All African People's Revolutionary Party is a revolutionary party based in Africa. And our objectives and goals are Pan-Africanism. And what we define as Pan-Africanism and what must be understood as Pan-Africanism is one united socialist Africa, or Africa united under scientific socialism. Um, and yeah, we just want to, we want to make that known that Pan-Africanism should never be divorced from the ideals of socialism and scientific socialism. And so, so we did the land acknowledgement. We always want to acknowledge, the fact that we're on stolen land here in the United States of America, or how they like to call it, or Turtle Island. And I'm out of occupied Ute territory, and Anisanu is in. Where are you from, Anisanu?
Occupied Tiwa territory is where I currently am, also known as Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Awesome. So today our episode is dedicated to honoring our ancestors, and this is like a thing we do honestly at every political education event that we do, whether it be online or in person, where we do land acknowledgements and we also honor our ancestors. And so this is basically like a broadening of that. And so we have a whole topic and stuff dedicated to honoring our ancestors today. And it's important because without our ancestors, we wouldn't be where we are today. Without their sacrifice, without their unrelenting determination in the fight for African liberation, we would not be here. And it's important to uplift that, and it's important to always remember that and keep that in mind, and to utilize the breadcrumbs that they left us, because they all left us amazing breadcrumbs, amazing work to so that we can grab hold to and continue the struggle and further the struggle in our own generation, in our own time, in our own moment. Today we're doing that. And so I guess we'll start it off. We chose, it was hard to choose, like specific ancestors to highlight. But we wanted to focus on the fact that African liberation is a global movement. And so, it's not just folks in America, or the United States. It's not just folks in Africa and stuff like that. We're a global people, and we have revolutionaries that have been connected on a global scale, on an international scale, since they stole us from Africa. And so we wanted to highlight that in the diasporic elements of our revolutionaries and stuff like that. So it's hard to choose, but first off, we'll talk. I guess we'll talk about Walter Rodney. Oh no, we'll talk about Safiya Bukhari. Safiya Bakari first. And so Safiya Bukhari was she was a member of the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army. She was born in 1944. I'm pretty sure 1944, and she started off in a middle class family. She was a child of 10, and so she started off in a middle class family. And what she says in her book, The War Before, that her whole idea was just making it. That she felt like, and her whole family felt like, if they just got a good education and did what they had to do, that they can make it, and that they can make something of themselves, and that they wouldn't be caught up in the everything that was plaguing Africans in this country at the time. And so she goes to she goes to high school, she goes to college, and she's studying to be a doctor. And she begins to get into movement work by she talks about joining a sorority, and that her sorority sisters were they needed a project to do, and so they decided to go to Harlem and to examine examine, for lack of better words, needy African children and poor children in New York. And so they went there, and she began to see. That's when the cracks started. She began to see the cracks in the system, and the cracks in the just making it, and just if you just do what the people tell you to do, if you just work hard enough, that you can make it. And so she began to see the cracks. And while she was in New York, she noticed the Black Panther Party, of course, doing their handing out their flyers and their papers and selling newspapers. And so she's like, okay, well, that's that seems cool. Of course, that's like a normal thing. But she began to see the repression from literally just from the police and the state and police repression against the Black Panther Party, who were the Black Panthers who were just selling newspapers. And so that helped her start to realize that everything she thought before wasn't exactly how it seemed. And so she began to further ingratiate herself into the Black Panther Party, and she began working with their free breakfast program that the Black Panthers are extremely known for, I guess I would say, where they would feed children in the morning, and they would give them political education. And she was doing that and feeding, and then she realized that more police repression came. They actually, the police in New York and stuff like that, and really all around with the Black Panthers, they would start telling kids' parents who were going to the breakfast program that they were having. The police would start telling them that the Black Panthers were feeding them poison food. And so kids started dropping out of the breakfast program and stopped coming. And so she's she's recognized, like, dude, we're just giving kids free food and talking to them about history and stuff like that. Like, what is the repression for? And so she talks about in her book, In the War Before, and in a lot of her other writings, that it wasn't like the conditions of Black people that drove her into the movement. It was the police. And so we constantly see that where the state and the colonial powers, they shoot themselves in the foot, because the repression often drives people into revolutionary attitudes and educating themselves about why the repression is going on, why repression is going on for simple things like reading and teaching and feeding children who need to be fed to learn in general. So that's around 1969 when she's getting more ingratiated with the Black Panthers. And by 71, that COINTELPRO had already, they were already active in destroying the Black Panthers and stuff like that. 1969, Fred Hampton gets shot. 1969, Fred Hampton gets shot. The Panther 21 arrested for trumped up charges, and that's all in New York where she's at. She's organizing with these people, and they get caught up. So by 1971, the split is already happening in the Panther Party. People are already going underground, and due to her, I would say, I don't know, they trusted the people who were going underground. They trusted her to stay above ground and to hold things and to take care of things above ground, as in regards to the party and party affairs and stuff like that. And so she stood above ground for a while, and she held out until the repression just became too much. After the Panther 21, they were released in 72, but by 1973, 74, they're already they're still attacking the Black Panthers. They're still attacking former members. And so it drove her underground, and she began to go underground with the Black Liberation Army, which is a under talked about organization for us. We focus on the Panthers a lot, and the Black Liberation Army was I guess you could say a subsidiary of that, but we don't talk about the BLA enough and their contributions to our struggle. And so she went underground with them, and unfortunately, she got into a situation where a robbery was taking place, and she was in prison in 1975. But this whole time, it just it's important to highlight that she was always in an organization, and she recognized the importance of organization and how it helped to free the Panther 21, and how it helped to sustain people that were underground and sustain the movement above ground as well. Because without organization, there's no way you get the level of dynamic action that the BLA displayed. And so I just think that's important. That's a theme for all of our revolutionaries. They recognize the importance of organizations, and they were always in. Once they got into it, they remained in organizations, or they started organizations fighting for the liberation of our people. And so that's a theme that is highlighted through all our revolutionaries, and it's something that we want to highlight today when we honor them. And so to further the story, she's arrested in 1975, and she actually escapes in the tradition of marriage that is known for our people, African people. She escaped because of the level of conditions of health conditions of healthcare she was not receiving while inside prison. And so she escaped, and unfortunately, they caught her, and she was returned to prison. But throughout, when she was in prison, she continued the legacy of what another ancestor we'll talk about today, Walter Rodney, I think maybe coined, which is a guerrilla intellectual. And so while she was in prison, she remained a guerrilla intellectual, and she wrote and she organized the women in the prison around things of healthcare and pregnancy and birth and women's birthrights and stuff like that, and womanhood and motherhood. And so it just, that's a thing that you see, that the work never stopped for our ancestors. It never stopped, even when they were exiled, arrested, incarcerated. The work never stopped, and they continued to organize our people because they recognize the importance of the constant struggle. And she while in prison from 1977 to 1984, when she was released, she was continuing organizing. After that, she started movements. She started the Jericho movement, which is a movement focused on political prisoners and stuff like that. That's still going strong today. They have a website up, and it just gives it's an amazing resource for prisoners, where you can write to them, you can read their works, you can give to their put money on their commissary and stuff like that. And so it's just something that she started is still available today for us to utilize to free our people. And so I feel like I'm going too long, but I just want to acknowledge the fact that that's something that we see with all of our ancestors, especially that we're highlighting today, that they did so much work. She also worked on the campaign to free Mumia. She started, the Free Mumia campaign. And unfortunately he's still in prison today. And so, but the work, it never ceases to end until victory is won. And so I just want to highlight that, and that she was a beacon for principled struggle, armed struggle, guerrilla intellectualism, and just that revolutionary spirit that can't be stolen or taken away, no matter where it is, no matter if it's incarcerated or exiled from or separated from their family. Sophia Bakari and the other ancestors we'll discuss never ceased, and that work is still there for us today to pick up and to carry on. And so
Great, thanks, Rashad. I actually didn't know that she started the Jericho movement. I feel like I learned something every time you present. Also, in the war before, she talks a lot about like the split, like why the Black Panther Party fell apart, like the mistakes they made, and like how they were able to be infiltrated, and like why COINTELPRO strategies were so successful against the Black Panther Party. And like one of the things that she talks about is how internal contradictions and like conflict were handled, how there was like a culture of like talking behind people's backs and like avoiding direct conversation, and just generally like seeing contradiction or seeing conflict and not like addressing that straight on, like not raising the struggle, not like working through it, not trying to like build toward greater unity, but instead just like having side conversations, like not talking to people, just like letting it fester, and how that was a major part of the reason why the party was so destroyed by those counter-revolutionary efforts. Like certainly there was an external force that attacked the Black Panther Party, that assassinated many Black Panther Party members, that like locked them up, but there were also serious internal contradictions that created the space where that was possible. And so like she talks about it in her book, Asada also talks about it, and Elaine Brown talks about it. And I feel like that's a really important lesson that we have to take from them. But the next ancestor that we want to feature on the program today is someone that folks watching are probably familiar with, because y'all have like revolutionary consciousness. So I am sure that you know who this is, but it is none other than Franz Fanon, revolutionary African ancestor, born July 1925 in the Caribbean nation of Martinique that was colonized by the French. He died December 1961, actually in Maryland, in Bethesda, Maryland, in a hospital. So he was a trained psychiatrist, meaning went to medical school, got his degree, was a professionally trained psychiatrist. He was also a revolutionary African fighter engaged in the African national liberation struggle, and quite as it's kept, he was a Pan-Africanist. He was a Pan-Africanist, and he was a Marxist. Two important things. So, similar to Safiya Bukhari, and actually like a lot of people, like Asada was like this too, Elaine Brown was like this too. Franz Fanon had like a more privileged background. He had like an upper middle class upbringing in Martinique. So he was like what we would call a petty bourgeois for his whole life. He was radicalized for the first time, when he witnessed French soldiers take over Martinique after the French defeat in World War II. He saw that their rule was like barbaric, very racist. They constantly engaged in acts of harassment and violence against the African people living in Martinique. And that was like one of the first times where he was like, who are these people to have control over us? Why are these like racist ass French soldiers throwing their weight around, harassing people? Like, why are they supposed to be better than us? Like, that was a radicalizing experience for Fanon, watching that French military occupation of the island where his people were from. It helped him start to realize the essential nature of colonialism. And this is, again, even having had a somewhat privileged background as compared to other African people. So a few years later, he travels to France. He meets César. César wrote the very famous essay, Discourse on Colonialism, where he's basically like, World War II happened because y'all did the Holocaust all over the world, and then like built that into your culture and never reckoned with that. And of course, it was going to come home. That's what Discourse on Colonialism was about. César ran for parliament, and Frantz Fanon supported his political campaign. César was also a communist. This is a recurring theme. Anti-colonial revolutionaries who are Pan-Africanists and communists. So from there, as Fanon continued his journey of radicalization, he became an active participant in Algeria's war for national liberation against the French. Martinique was colonized by the French. He went to Algeria and supported another colonized people's liberation struggle against that same colonial power. He became a member of the Algerian National Liberation Front, and it is that period for the rest of his life where he writes the books that he is most famous for. So those books include Black Skins, White Mass, which is actually before he joins the anti-colonial struggle, when he's like developing that anti-colonial consciousness, developing that race consciousness, and like trying to like unpack the psychological impacts of subjugation on colonized people and like what it looks like. He also wrote The Wretched of the Earth, which is about the national liberation struggle in Algeria and also the aftermath where neocolonialism emerged, and he talks about why that happened. He wrote A Dying Colonialism, which is like an on-the-ground report about the strategies of the national liberation struggle in Algeria, and particularly about like the contribution of the masses of people in Algeria to that struggle, the cultural revolution they undertook to restore the historical personality and overthrow French ideologies of oppression. And then he also wrote, this was released after he died, and it's like a compilation of like letters and like essays he wrote. It's called Toward African Freedom. And in that book, which is again was released posthumously, is the clearest indication of Fanon's Pan-African ideology. So some of the themes that you see in much of Fanon's work, which is again is like hugely influential, like the Black Panther Party read Fanon, the APRP reads Fanon, like the Vietnamese National Liberation movement reads Fanon. Like it was hugely influential in anti-colonial struggles all over the world. Even though this was an African man writing about an African context, the themes that he explored in his works were like universal for colonized people. So some of the themes that you find in Fanon's work are the idea of the alienation of the so-called colonial subject in colonial societies, like the way that, for example, African people are taught that we're inferior to Europeans, the way that we're taught that we're intrinsically uncivilized, that we are not capable of any kind of coherent self-rule, that we are ugly, that we are just lesser than. Like that is like a common strategy of colonialism to inculcate those beliefs in upon a subjugated nation. So he talks about all about that, particularly in Black Skins, White Masks, and also about how African people, particularly like the petty B African people, aspire to a Europeanness that they will never, ever, ever have access to. It's not ever going to happen. It's not happening for you. So yeah, he writes about that in Black Skin, White Masks. He also is very, very famous for, particularly in The Wretched of the Earth, talking about how colonized people have the right to resist colonialism with violence, full stop, period. He talks about the foundational violence of colonization, how it's made up of a series of like massacres, of exploitations, of ongoing systematic oppression that's meant to like beat down an entire nation of people, and how that nation of people has the right to respond by any means necessary to end that condition. He says there is no comparison whatsoever between the violence of the colonized resisting our oppression and the violence of the colonizer upholding that oppression. This is something that he's usually reduced to either that Black skin, white mass analysis or that theory of violence, the justification of violence in colonial situations. And like those are like powerful contributions that we must learn from. But the way that he is reduced to like those things is a sign of larger contradictions in the society, which I'll talk about in a second. Also, particularly in Towards Colonial Freedom, where again he's talking about the contribution of the masses of African people in Algeria to their national liberation struggle, he talks about the necessity of cultural revolution. He talks about the necessity of colonized people reclaiming our culture that existed as it was before colonization, and talks about the necessity of reclaiming our place in history, our conception of our identity, not a conception of identity imposed upon us by the colonizer as a necessary part of a national liberation struggle. So he talks about the necessity of anti-colonial violence. He talks about the necessity of cultural revolution. And he also talks about the necessity of class struggle, because that's the other major theme in his work. In situations where an armed struggle has been carried out against colonization, where all sectors of a society unite, from the peasants and the working class, the national bourgeois and the petty bourgeois. But then after the armed struggle against colonization is finished, what ends up happening in place after place after place, if the class struggle is not waged, is that that national bourgeois and that national petty bourgeois sell everybody out. They like rebuild ties with imperialism to maintain their position in the so-called post-colonial society, which leads to the emergence of neocolonialism. And so he talks about that at length in The Wretched of the Earth. I forget the chapter, what it's called, but it's really important. Oh yeah, the pitfalls of national consciousness. The pitfalls of national consciousness. Because in a revolutionary anti-colonial struggle where the entire nation is oppressed, people unite across classes to fight back against that foreign domination. But then when the foreign domination is defeated, the class contradictions come to the forefront, and the upper classes sell everybody out. They use their position to make sure that they remain on top at the expense of everybody else. And so he talks about why that happens in The Wretched of the Earth in that chapter, The Pitfalls of National Consciousness. And he also talks about how the mass organization of the working and peasant classes of a colonized nation is a necessary prerequisite to avoiding that pivot to neocolonialism. If the masses of people are not the agents of the armed anti-colonial struggle, if they are not class conscious and waging a class struggle against both the external enemy and the internal enemy, then they will fall back to colonization in the form of neocolonialism. So another major theme in his work, also in towards colonial freedom, in oh my god, what's that book? Sorry. I'm like, oh yeah, Toward African Freedom. A Dying Colonialism is a book about the contributions of the Algerian people. And then Toward African Freedom is the book where he talks about Pan-Africanism. So in Toward African Freedom, he again makes it clear he is a revolutionary Pan-Africanist, as well as a Marxist, as well as a socialist. So in Toward African Freedom, he talks about how in order for Africa to definitively defeat colonialism once and for all, we need continental African unity and we need socialism. Point blank, period. He says it explicitly in the chapter on African unity. So people never, very, very rarely talk about Frantz Fanon as a pan-African revolutionary. They also rarely talk about him as a socialist for some reason, even though there was no question. He always talked about class struggle, but that is where he makes it explicit. And also in that book, Toward African Freedom, he's talking about the political situations that unfolded in the African continent after the period of armed decolonization, or during the period of armed decolonization. In particular, he talks about the crisis in the Congo that unfolded after Patrice Lumumba was elected by the masses of people in the Congo, and then the US and Belgium and other European nations immediately moved to undermine Patrice Lumumba's rule. They backed a secessionist movement in Katanga, backed by the sellout Moise Tshombe, who betrayed Lumumba, who balkanized the Congo. The free Congo state was deprived of resources. And so in Towards African Freedom, he actually criticizes many of the independent African nations who attempted to intervene in that situation. Because what ended up happening, and this includes people like Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Touré, Sekou Touré did not want to do this, Kwame Nkrumah did. They went with the United Nations. They relied on the United Nations to attempt to mediate the crisis in the Congo. And what ended up happening is that Ghanaian troops that the CPP gave to the UN mission in the Congo ended up being collaborators in Patrice Lumumba's assassination. And Sekou Touré was like, we should just go out there and save him. And Nkrumah was like, let's do it the right way. And that's what ended up happening. So in Towards African Freedom, Frantz Fanon was like, y'all should never have trusted the United Nations. You should have found an African solution to that problem that relying on this structure that is dominated by the enemy, dominated by Western capitalist nations, is what doomed Patrice Lumumba. And to be honest with you, he wasn't wrong. He wasn't wrong, and Sekou Touré wasn't either. They should have just went there and saved him. So in any case, those are some of the major themes discussed in Frantz Fanon's works. Again, extremely influential. And the last thing I want to say about Fanon is that he's almost like a cipher. Like people see, like what's that thing where you like look at black blobs on a paper and you like try to see the shape? It's like a Rorschach test. He's like that, where people see what they want to see. like I've noticed, for example, like he's read widely across many sectors of society. He's read by, revolutionary organizations like ours, but he's also read heavily in academia. But they tend to like focus on like one particular part. Like I've noticed like the Black academics and the Afro pessimists, they tend to focus on like black skin, white mass. Like nothing else happened after that. Like black skin, white mass was like an important contribution, but it was clearly a particular stage of consciousness that he advanced beyond. And they tend to like focus on that analysis, I think because it's like the most relevant to that particular context, like wanting to be European and the psychological consequences of that. And then other times you'll see people, other people will like look at the black Fanon shape on the paper and see someone who was like solely focused on violence without any other particular context, not class struggle, not cultural revolution, solely fucking up colonizers, which, I understand, but it was like part of a larger strategy that he was laying out in great detail. And so Fanon is sort of treated like people see in him what they want to see. It is very rare that they look at the entire picture, the psychological analysis, the revolutionary anti-colonial consciousness, the Pan-Africanism, and the Marxism all together. He gets like looked at in chunks, and then people pull out the parts of his work that will legitimize what they're saying without looking at the whole. And the other thing that people tend to do that I've noticed is they tend to try to put him in conflict with other African revolutionaries, particularly with other Pan-African revolutionaries, when again, this is a man who understood the necessity of a continental-wide struggle for African liberation, who understood the necessity of African unity to build socialism. And so the way that people are like, not Fanon, but this guy, or this guy, not Fanon, you know what I'm saying? Like it doesn't actually make any sense. And it again, see people looking at Fanon and like seeing what they want to see and pulling out what's going to reinforce their own particular internal contradictions and liberalism. And so I would want to conclude by saying, like, read all the Fanon. Don't just like get to black skin, white mass and be like, I'm going to stop right here. and I'm going to talk in depth about how I want white women, they don't want me. No. Instead, you got to talk about Black Skin, White Mask. You got to read Wretched of the Earth. You got to read A Dying Colonialism, read Toward African Freedom, read the entire ideological trajectory of this person to pull the lessons that we need for this struggle, because much of what he wrote is still relevant, but the way that we're using it is not going to get us anywhere. So take the whole picture. So yeah, that's Franz Fanon. And I'm going to pass it to Rashad for the next person.
Yeah, and it's funny that you say that. Salifu put in the chat, shout out to Salifu. But yeah, he put in the chat, they do the same thing with Du Bois, where they, people like to extract certain parts of his life, even though, we all know Du Bois, how long Du Bois lived. And, like you said, the ideological trajectories of these people, we have to take the entirety of it to be able to understand exactly what to do, what to do next, and what to take from them and what to not, So yeah, that's important. But so next we'll talk about Walter Rodney. And Walter Rodney, he was a Guyanese historian. He was a political activist and an academic. But I don't know. To me, I just think of him as like, he's definitely a historian. But he was just like, he's one of the most like underrated, but also, I don't know. People are. I think a lot of people now are starting to realize the contributions that he made to the struggle. In my opinion, as a worldwide figure, he's underrated. But so he was born in 1942 in Georgetown, Guyana, which was then British Guyana, and he was unfortunately assassinated in 1980 in Guyana. And so he started out as like in Guyana. His father was a member of a political organization. I can't remember what the name was in Guyana, but it was a labor party. And so, he had that grounding from the beginning of like, how labor was intertwined with capitalism and society. And so he obviously excelled in all of his in everything, in all of his schooling and stuff like that. And he was able to receive honors and scholarships to study in Jamaica at the University of the West Indies. And so that's where that's where the beginning of his political ideology growing and developing. Because while he was in Jamaica, he was able to see what was going on as a student and stuff like that. But he was also able to kick it with the regular folks in Jamaica and stuff like that. He had close ties with the poor, the Rastas down there who were extremely oppressed in Jamaica at the time. And so he writes about that a lot. He actually has a book, Groundings with My Brothers, where he discusses those discussions, where a lot of it is just discussions he was having with the masses of the people in Jamaica and stuff like that. But it's a great book because it shows just how he had an ability to break things down for people. Being an extremely intellectual person and the academic and stuff like that, it's crazy. But he was able, I mean, not crazy, but he was able to take that and bring it to the material base of where people were at and help them understand it in a way that made sense to them. And he was able to do that throughout his life. And so his contributions, his writings are like some of the most important things for anyone wanting to study African history or the dialectical nature of how we are where we are in the diaspora, but also most specifically Africa as the in the continent. So everyone should know, but I don't know, everyone should know, but I know a lot of people still don't know about his seminal work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And in that book, he discusses how as African people our internal development was disrupted by outside forces, specifically the European forces. And it started before the slave trade, but it intensified with the slave trade, obviously. And he highlights in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, just the nature of stealing millions of young people from the continent, how the effects of that, and how that not only stymied our progress as a people, as a continent, but it also led to underdevelopment and overexploitation that extracted all the resources from Africa and were used to build up the Americas and North America, Canada, and Europe. And so he just it's one of the most complete works like you'll probably ever read about, historical context of Africa and its outside forces that came to destroy it. And so it's extremely comprehensive, and throughout it it's just that's like the main theme of in all of his writings was how outside forces and how the dialectical nature of history went into um, what making things what it is today. And so he ended up teaching at Dar es Salaam, and this is which is in Tanzania, a university in Tanzania, while they were undergoing their revolution, their socialist revolution under Julius Nyerere. And so during this time, that's when he wrote How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, while also having a child and while also still engaged in political activism and lecturing all over the world. And so he taught at Tanzania. He tried to go back to Ghana, but then they exiled him after he lectured. He had a gay lecture in Canada. They exiled him because the Guyanese government realized. No, Jamaica. I'm sorry. He was exiled from Jamaica. He tried to go back to teach at Jamaica, but he was exiled from Jamaica because I think it was Forbes Burnham. Forbes Burnham didn't want him there, and so so he was exiled and he was not able to return to Jamaica, and so then he went back to Tanzania and taught at Dar es Salaam until 1974, and then he realized he had to go back to Guyana to further the struggle in his hometown and his home nation. And so he went back and he began to teach until he was expelled from teaching African history at the university in Guyana. And that, to me, it honestly just helped him because, he continued that tradition of guerrilla intellectualism outside the university where it could actually benefit, more people and the masses of the people. And he began to realize the need to create an organization. He created a political organization, the People's Congress. I'm pretty sure it's the People's Congress. I know there's like another word in the acronym, and I'm sorry for forgetting it. But so he started a political party, and it was made to bridge the gap between the Indian immigrants that were brought by the Europeans as a buffer during slavery, who had their own political establishment, and the Africans in Guyana who had their own political establishment. And he realized the necessity of bringing these forces together into one party under, again, as we want to highlight, under a scientific socialist tendency and a Marxist tendency, communist tendency. And so, it's just he was undyingly dedicated to bringing socialism to Guyana and to bringing actual true liberation to the Caribbean islands, And so, like Anya-san was talking about, if without the class struggle element, you're gonna fall back into neocolonialism. And so he recognized that, and the class struggle was in all of his writings and his teachings. Was like one of the most important things, along with how along with the development of forces and stuff like that. So he has works that have just been that have recently been republished and called there's one coming out that I really want to read in August, a Pan-African view of revolution. Obviously, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. He has groundings with my brothers. His doctoral thesis was on people's history of Guyanese workers, and so he had that class element always, because it's without it, the struggle is mute, and so the moot. And so even while in Tanzania, that's kind of even though they were trending towards socialism, he felt that he always kept hope that that it would be what everyone thought, that Tanzania would be what it thought it would be, like a socialist government fighting for the liberation of the rest of the liberation of the rest of Africa. But he realized eventually, from being connected to the people, that that's not what was going on, unfortunately. And so the class struggle, the class element of that struggle in Tanzania was missing at that moment in time. And so he never admonished them. He always kept hope, but he was able to keep a principled line and understand that while I hope for this to go the way I want it to and how I think it should go, without that class element, it's not gonna, it won't flourish in the way it needs to. And so yeah, and I just think it's extremely important to recognize that like, he was a Pan-Africanist as well, and so he recognized the necessity for African liberation, especially continental Africa. And so that's why he spent most of his time was spent in Tanzania, helping to try to build the revolution in the best way he can. He went to Zimbabwe and celebrated their liberation, invited by the president Robert Mugabe. And so he recognized the fact that Africa was central, but he also was never divorced from the masses of the people where he was at, in Guyana or Jamaica in the Caribbean islands. And he also tried to spread his love to those of us here in the U.S. And so he actually has he wrote while in Tanzania, he had I think it was like a magazine, and he published a story about George Jackson, a political prisoner here, when he was murdered. And he talks about the necessity of bridging the gap between all of us in the diaspora and on the continent, and realizing that the same things that are happening that were happening in America, where political prisoners are locked up and being murdered for nothing, the same things going on in South Africa at the time in the 1970s, and the same thing is going on in the Caribbean islands. And so he was always able to keep that in mind, that we are a global people, and that the interconnectedness of our situation has to be taken seriously, and we have to use that as a means, as a tool, as a weapon for liberation. We have to use that to our benefit and not allow the enemy to separate and divide us amongst inside their colonial borders. And so he was murdered, unfortunately, in 1980 by a bomb, a package bomb that was delivered to him. And he and so it's unfortunate, but that's they recognized all these forces. They recognize the power of our revolutionary leaders, and they are terrified of what these people can bring about, because they saw him talking to hundreds of poor Jamaican kids and stuff like that, and how they were receptive to what he was teaching them. And when he was exiled, they have a thing in Jamaica where they call it the Rodney riots, because when he was exiled from Jamaica, the people went crazy, because they were like, bro, you're not going to not let our dude come back here and be able to teach us and stuff like that. And so, there was riots, not only amongst the students where he would, who loved him, obviously, but, the masses of the people, because he always was connected to the masses of the people. And so I think that's an extremely important thing to remember, about our ancestors and about our mission, that we have to be in tune with the masses of the people and understand that we're them and they're us, and that without them there is no struggle, and without helping all of us to recognize the class element and the class struggle, and also the cultural element, because he was big in the Black Power, and in the Black Power movement, and reframing it into a Caribbean context. We always want to remember that that's like the most important point, the class struggle and bridging the gap between our different colonial borders and our separation by imperialism and the trade and traffic of enslaved Africans. So yeah.
Cool. I actually meant to play in the beginning a clip of Walter Rodney speaking at African Liberation Day, 1972, in Washington, D.C. It was like organized heavily by members of the APRP, and he's like giving a speech where he's like, "We're African people." Period. I'll play it at the end because I forgot to play it at the beginning, but it's really cool. The other thing I want to say about Walter Rodney is that he was murdered when he was 38 years old. He was like mad young. He wrote How Europe Underdeveloped Africa in his 20s. It's kind of wild. It's kind of wild. And the other thing I wanted to bring up is there are so there was like discourse going around on the internet about how Kwame Nkrumah never talked about class. And what I realized when I looked into it is because the source of that is actually 2 essays that Walter Rodney wrote where he was heavily critical of Kwame Nkrumah. And it was interesting to me because when I read them, I was like, this is not necessarily like an accurate analysis of what was going on in Ghana under Nkrumah or of Nkrumah's politics. Like, I wonder how this happened. And so I was like trying to like track down the sources. Actually, someone who was arguing with me helped me find it. And it turned out that it wasn't the essays were not written based on like a firsthand investigation of the Ghana under the CPP and Nkrumah. They were actually based upon this book that was released after Nkrumah was overthrown in the CIA-backed coup by 2 European Marxists based in the United States. And one thing that we should know, wherever there's like a socialist project throughout the world, whether it's Cuba, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Ghana, whether it's Vietnam, there's going to be European socialists in the West attacking it. It's just kind of how it is. So it was really interesting to me because like How Europe Underdeveloped Africa is like the opposite. The reason why that work holds up is because it is very, very clear that a deep level of investigation based on primary sources was undertaken by Rodney to make the argument that he makes in that book. It is a clear dialectical and historical materialist analysis of the impact of European imperialism on the African continent. And so that's why to this day, it is still accurate. It still holds up. But with those Nkrumah essays, same dude. And it was within a few years of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, there wasn't that investigation and there wasn't a reliance on primary sources. And the takeaway from that, like I remember when I like brought it up to someone, they were like, "Oh, is it like fuck Rodney now?" And I was like, no, because he still made his contribution. He still wrote How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Like those still hold up. No one is required to be right all the time. I'm not right all the time. Are you right all the time, Rashad?
I don't think so.
It's not human beings. So all that means is that no matter who you are, you could be a brilliant Pan-African revolutionary, a great academic, a great researcher, and if you don't do that basic level of investigation, you yourself will come to the wrong conclusions. That's all that says. It just means what Mao said: no investigation, no right to speak. If you want to understand what happened in Ghana, you must rely on primary sources to understand what happened in Ghana. If you want to understand how Europe underdeveloped Africa, you have to rely on primary sources and investigation to understand how Europe underdeveloped Africa. If you skip that step, no matter who you are, you are going to make mistakes. And I feel like that's all that is. That is all that is. So I just want to like address that head on because, yeah, people be talking. And I feel like it's important to be clear when things went wrong, but also refuse to like attack or like deny or like throw away the contributions of our ancestors or our ancestors themselves. Like own all the mistakes they made. Like Nkrumah built socialism in Ghana with the CPP, period. However, Nkrumah made serious mistakes when it came to the crisis in the Congo and Patrice Lumumba. Both of those things are true. It's absolutely fine. It doesn't take away anything from the contributions Nkrumah made to the liberation of Ghana and to the liberation of Africa as a whole. So that's it. That's it. That's all I want to say. Any case, so next ancestor, Winnie Mandela. Put some respect on her name because she gets lied on, denigrated. People like lump her in with the sellout tendency in the ANC. It's terrible. It's terrible. So we're going to put some respect on her name today. Winnie Mandela, known as the mother of the nation, born September 26, 1936 in South Africa, became an ancestor actually quite recently, just 4 years ago, in April of 2018, also in South Africa. She was a member of the African National Congress, a leader of the Women's League of the African National Congress, or of the ANC. One very important thing to understand is that there was like a militant revolutionary tendency within the ANC, and there was a comprador tendency within the ANC. It is very clear today which tendency won out, But we have to understand that within that organization, there were people fighting for decolonization. There were people who upheld the necessity of armed struggle, and there were people who were compradors. Winnie was part of the militants. She always was till the day she died. So she was also an active participant in the Black consciousness movement initiated by Steve Biko in Azania. She basically lived a life of uncompromising mass resistance. She was engaged in active political work, a member of organizations fighting for the return of land and decolonization in Azania for her entire adult life. She belonged to the militant wing of the ANC alongside people like Chris Hani, alongside people like Oliver Tambo. Put some respect on her name, recognize the different political tendencies that were within that one mass organization. She was also a 4-time political prisoner. They stayed locking this woman up, continuously locking this woman up. So the first time she was arrested with 1,000 other women in Johannesburg, Azania. They were protesting against the past laws that had been passed by the illegal settler regime. They were basically saying you have to have documentation to go around freely on your own goddamn land. And the women, alongside Winnie, were like, no. And so they all got arrested, protesting this ridiculous law passed by the settler government. They were locked up. They refused bail. They were like, nope, we are going to continue to protest in jail. You can go to hell with that. Winnie was pregnant at the time with Nelson Mandela's baby. She stayed up locked up for 2 weeks with 1,000 other women, pregnant, solely because they were like, we are standing on our principle. We are upholding this protest. We will not use passes to be allowed to travel on our own land. Who the hell are y'all? That's the first time. Second time she was locked up, it was her longest incarceration. That was in Pretoria prison for 491 days. Actually, she has like a memoir called 491 Days. That's actually a really good book that talks about like this time in her life. But she was subjected to solitary confinement, which is a form of torture in and of itself. She was subjected to ongoing abuse by the guards, denied access to medicine, denied access to food, constantly subjected to interrogations when she had like no sleep and no food, just all kinds of like wild abuse this woman suffered after being locked up for that 491 days in Pretoria prison. The charges that she was incarcerated for were ultimately dropped in February of 1970 because they found the police had tortured her, and that made the whole case illegitimate. So that's the second time she was locked up, 491 days in solitary confinement. Third time, because she was locked up 4 times in her life. And just like as I'm talking about these experiences, being locked up while pregnant, being in solitary confinement for 491 days, like think about the psychological impact of that kind of abuse upon, it's just like a regular woman who wanted to make a contribution to the liberation struggle of her people and undertook great sacrifice and suffering in order to do so. So 4th time she was locked up, she was actually sent to jail because she was talking to another African revolutionary. His name is Peter Magubani. He was like a so-called banned person by the settler government. They had lunch together and talked, and she got arrested for that. That is the kind of oppressive regime that Europeans brought to Azania, that they upheld, and that they criminalized African people like Winnie for fighting back against. Like she had a conversation with some dude over lunch, and she went to jail for 6 months. For 6 months. She was initially sentenced to 3 years for talking to someone. They were both born in South Africa, and they were like, that's an illegal person you can't talk to. This person who was born, oh my God, it makes no sense. Like settler colonialism is the most raggedy shit on the face of the planet. Anyway, so she served 6 months for having a goddamn conversation with Peter Magubani, first at Johannesburg Fort Prison, and then at Kroonstad Prison. She was released. Then the 4th time, she was arrested alongside other organizers for helping to organize the Soweto student uprising that ended in a massacre by the settler police force in Azania. She was held for 4 months alongside other women who had helped organize that student uprising, again for the crime of engaging in mass resistance and against an illegal European settler occupation of her own land. Every single time she was locked up, whether it was for organizing the Soweto uprising, whether it was for protesting against the past laws, whether it was for having a goddamn conversation with another African person, it was always about the illegitimate, illegal settler occupation attempting to criminalize her and other African people for fighting back against a baldly exploitative condition. It was absurd. absurd. This woman spent years of her life in jail, and her husband spent years of his life in jail for the so-called crime of fighting for their own land, of fighting for their own territory. That's wild. That's wild. And that's like the condition in occupied Palestine. That's the condition of indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere. Like, settler colonialism is some bullshit. So in any case, she was released after that fourth time. Nelson Mandela was locked up, and she campaigned for his release as a political prisoner for years, raised their kids on the outside by herself, still made contributions to the armed struggle against settler colonialism for the land back in Azania, made remarkable sacrifices. This woman, for her whole life, she aligned herself with the fight to take the land back, not just in Azania, but it also in Zimbabwe and throughout Southern Africa. She believed that the indigenous African people had the right to use any means necessary, including violence, to take their land back, period. After the fall of so-called apartheid, which, a side note, the primary contradiction in Azania was never apartheid. It was never apartheid. It was never about that structure of control. That structure of control was a strategy created to control, to have Europeans claim access to African land. The primary contradiction in Azania was always who controlled the land, which is why when apartheid fell, the European settlers still control the land, which is why to this day, over 70% of the land in Azania is controlled by European settlers. Apartheid is long gone. They got a series of African presidents, and the African people in Azania still do not have their land. The land was the primary contradiction, not apartheid. So apartheid fell. They built that so-called unity government. Nelson Mandela was elected the first African president of Azania, and they held this farce, this straight up farce known as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the late 90s. I believe it started in 1997. It was chaired by Desmond Tutu's raggedy ass. Let me not be disrespectful, but man. So at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the reason why I'm calling it a farce is because they basically acted like the Africans that were engaged in armed struggle for their land back to end settler colonialism were equally as bad as the European settlers that had stole their land, that had subjugated them for generations, that had engaged in massacres for hundreds of years. They said, you guys are both bad. Say sorry, kiss and make up. That's what they did. So they got Winnie on the stand, and there was a point where Desmond Tutu was like, just say sorry. Just say sorry for engaging in a struggle for decolonization. Just say sorry for using violence to try to get African people's land back. And Winnie was like, no. She refused. She refused. She looked in his face and she was like, no, I will not. And she always, for the entirety of her life, was like, we had the right to do that. It was not wrong. Colonized people, just like Fanon said, colonized people have the right to use violence to end the colonial condition, point blank, period. She stood on that for her whole life in front of the whole world in those hearings until the day she died. She was like, we had the right to do that. That is why you put some respect on Winnie Mandela's name, because so much of the rest of the ANC leadership that was not killed or locked up sold that shit out, acted like it was the same thing, the violence of the colonized and the violence of the colonizer, and she refused to do it. And it's so important. That's part of the reason why the mass of people in Azania loved her until she died, because she was like, land back, period, by any means necessary. And the last thing I'll say about her is that she was, like all of the Africans we're talking about today, a revolutionary Pan-Africanist. She understood that the liberation of Azania was inextricably connected to the liberation of the rest of the African continent. Her vision was not an exceptionalized version of the struggle in South Africa. It was much, much closer to that of the PAC and people like Robert Sobukwe, who understand the liberation of Azania. The return of land in Azania is tied to the liberation and the return of land in all of Africa. So that's Winnie Mandela, and I love her. Can you tell? I'm going to pass it back to you, Rashad.
Yeah, put some respect on Winnie's name, because like there's a lot of confusion that goes around with our ancestors, because they like to lie on our folks and tell stories that aren't fucking true. So yeah, put some respect on Winnie's name. But so yeah, next we'll talk about we're gonna talk about Samora Machel, who was a Mozambican revolutionary um, general for the People's Army of Frelimo, and also the first president of independent Mozambique. And so he was born in September 1933, and he was assassinated. People like to say, you know, it's just a plane crash, but he was assassinated in 1986. Um, and so he actually, I think maybe a little bit differently than the other ancestors we've highlighted today. He was born fairly poor, and actually, what is like it's pretty interesting to me. What's called the Gaza. I don't know if you pronounce it like that, but it's spelled the same way. So the Gaza province in Mozambique, and so he grew up like on a farm, and so he was fairly poor, and but his father actually was like a successful farmer. So you know he ended up having some cattle and that maybe like other rural African people in Mozambique didn't have, and so yeah. But you know he grew up fairly poor, and he went to school, and he began to realize the Portuguese was colonized. The Portuguese were the people who were colonized Mozambique at the time, along with a few other African countries that we talked about before, obviously Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and so yeah. So he went to school, and he started to realize that you know stuff wasn't he started to realize that there you know the racism and stuff like that, and that he couldn't actually do the things that he thought he could he should be able to do, and so he wasn't allowed to go to higher education, and so after that he decided to he was like, all right, bet. Well, he decided to go to to Algeria actually, and so it was like 1955 when he went to Algeria, and he decided that he would receive military training from them, and so in the same place where Frantz Fanon went to fight with the Algerians, he went to learn from them and learn military strategy and tactics in Algeria, and so I think that's it's just funny because it's all these things are happening at the at similar times and stuff like that, and all the connections are being made at the time, and it's just like it's just like a powerful thing for me. I love like researching our ancestors and our revolutionaries because especially during the 50s, 60s, and 70s when liberation struggles were taking place, obviously on the continent of Africa, but also you get the Black Power movement here. Along with the civil rights movement, and just how all the powers coalesced at the same time, but not in the and it produced victories, obviously, but like it just I just like to think of the fact that it was connected, and people were that like the forces were coalescing, but not in the strength and force that was necessary to be able to sustain and not have our leaders in our be assassinated and parts of our movement be destroyed. And so so that's 1955. He's in Algeria training, and then he decides to come back to Mozambique to actually fight against the Portuguese. And during this time, he began to like show how what bright of a mind he had for military and tactical strategy. And so he quickly rose up the ranks in the People Army, and eventually he became the general. And so he almost, to me, like Cabral that we talked about last weekly Pan African News, he had a idea of how to wage struggle in the military sense, and he also used it to he also used Marxism and Leninism to help guide guide the soldiers and stuff like that during the time of the armed struggle. And so I think that's important. You know what I mean? Like he recognized, and Frelimo recognized, which is the revolutionary organization that led Mozambique to independence. They realized the importance of socialism and communism in the fight for liberation, and like we talked about before, the element of the class struggle. And so as he's rising up in the ranks and becoming general and fighting the Portuguese colonialists, they have their hands tied with Angola and with Guinea-Bissau at the time. But So it's they didn't really want to keep fighting, and so like a lot of Portuguese soldiers will just like be like, all right, bro, we're fed up, we're not about to really do this. And so in the midst of that, they actually Portuguese armed forces actually overthrew the in Portugal, and so they expected this to be like some like thing like where Samora Machel and Mozambique would be like, oh, okay, well, yeah, you guys got a different government, y'all good, we can hash things out, and you guys can still keep colonizing us, and since you guys are different, you guys aren't the extreme fascist that was in government before, we can kick it. But Samora Machel had other ideas, and he was like, nah, we're gonna if y'all aren't trying to give us independence, then we're not gonna stop the armed struggle. And so even though your soldiers might be tired and you might have a different government, we're going to keep going because we're winning already. And there was already liberated zones in Mozambique at the time. And this is around 1974. And so he decided to continue the armed struggle against the Portuguese colonialists. And eventually, and I think it was like a year or two after that, 1975, they declared the complete independence of Mozambique. And to me, one of the most important things about Samora Machel was how he carried out the revolution after the armed struggle and nation building. He always talks about he talked about organization is the only way. And there's an awesome article on Hood Communist by I think a few of the editors where they talk about how they talk about his discussions on production and how after the revolution and continuing it in nation building of Mozambique, he talked about the necessity of production. And so he talked about how production is not only meant to produce the things that people need, that we need obviously, but also is a means to learn. So like you can be illiterate or not able to read and be able to work a field and learn more about the soil and the grass and food than someone might be who went to college for 5 years and studied agronomy but never put their hands in the dirt. And so he always stressed that like there was the need for learning along with doing. And he I think he has a quote where he says, as we learn we do, and what we do we use it to learn and to further the struggle. And so that's like it's indispensable because you see that as like a thread between all of the ancestors we highlighted today, that they actually went in and started doing work, and from the work they were able to discern what to do next and how to advance the struggle in their own way. People, Sophia Bakari got locked up. They told her when she got released that she couldn't, work with the Panthers. She couldn't have any affiliation with that. So she was like, okay, bet. Well, I can still help the movement by getting involved with political prisoners and starting the Jericho movement, helping to free Mumia. And so, there's all these different ways that our ancestors were able to help further the struggle in their own way. And so, Samora Machel's was in the beginning armed struggle, and he had the military knowledge and mind to help further that front. And so I think that's extremely important. I do want to highlight so after, along with the stress of importance of production and learning and study and education and stuff like that for for everyone, the masses of the people. He also, there's a documentary or like a little, I guess you could call it a documentary on YouTube where he's, it's focused on like I wouldn't say a trial, but they the traders of Mozambique. So people in Mozambique, Africans who decided to help the Portuguese in the fight instead of their own people. He in the little documentary, he just talks about, instead of having these people killed and stuff like that, like to me, which maybe, could have been the right move anyway. But instead of doing that, he decided to have a mass demonstration where everyone was allowed to, where a whole bunch of people were allowed to come into this auditorium and listen to the person speak of why they chose to betray their own people. And so they got to tell their side of the story. And even though it might have been bullshit, which a lot of it was, it doesn't, there is no reason to betray your people. But he allowed them to speak. He gave them criticism. He allowed them to give themselves self-criticism. And he decided, he was like, okay, you're still an African. You're still Mozambican. So, we're gonna hold you accountable. We're gonna keep you in the fold. We're gonna allow you to redeem yourself through work through study and through your dedication to the people. And so I think that's like an extremely humanist thing to do. And to me, it's like, our people are our people. And so, obviously some betrayers are going to get, what happens to them is what happens to them. But at the same time, when you're nation building, I think it's important I think what he did was an extremely important and like underlooked facet of that. And it's forgiveness and compassion and recognizing the dialectical forces that may make some people more apt to betrayal than others and stuff like that. And so I think that's important, and because he came again from the tradition of Marxism-Leninism, but also, just a scientific socialism and dialectical and historical materialism, and how those interrelations play with each other, and how that can affect people even during a liberation struggle. And so I just want to highlight that that's like an important thing that I think all of the ancestors we highlight today were focused on. And it wasn't just, you can say it was just about violence. Obviously, Samora Machel, Franz Fanon, they decided, that armed struggle was a viable means. Safiya Bukhari was, they decided that armed struggle was a viable means for African liberation. But that wasn't the only focus. Obviously we've been highlighting the fact that class consciousness and the class struggle was up there, and cultural revolution and retaining what we had lost and what was stolen from us in terms of our culture and what we were before in our African heritage. That was paramount, along with armed struggle, to African liberation. And I think, when we honor our ancestors, I think we, like we talked about in the beginning, it's important to recognize their contributions in their entirety. And we don't want to, obviously want to extract and, use what is useful. But I think even the failures and the missteps or the ideological changes are also important for us to study and to analyze and use for ourselves to further our struggle, so that we don't fall into the same pitfalls and, make the same mistakes, because they did them so we didn't have to do them. And so I think that concludes our section on honoring our ancestors. But I just, shout out to them, because it's just like, I don't know, there is no greater like thing to do than fight for the liberation of your people. And so our freedom fighters, they did something for they fulfilled what they had to do. And so now it's our turn to carry that on. And so, yeah.
Cool. There is one last thing I want to say about the honoring our ancestors. I want to talk about how to be a good ancestor. But first, yes. I want to say, regarding Samora Machel and like what you just described about like the Africans in Mozambique that like, aligned with the Portuguese against the revolution, and how like they didn't choose to like execute them. They chose to like work with them and like, bring them back in. I feel like the first time I heard that, the first time I learned about it, I was like, oh, that's like transformative justice. It's like, and transformative justice, for folks that don't know, is a way of dealing with abuse and harm and movements that not only addresses like the immediate situation, but also works to transform the conditions that produce the abuse and harm in the first place. Because if you know anything about how abuse and harm happens, you know that it's like never out of nowhere. There's also always like cultural, like, the culture of the organization is a factor, the internal contradictions, whether it be patriarchy, whether it be white supremacy are a factor, ableism are a factor. Like there's always like signs leading up to the moment where it like blows up into a situation of abuse. And so transformative justice is about like understanding how we got there and like changing that, as well as addressing the person that caused harm and like working on the healing of the person who experienced harm. And I feel like the foundation of transformative justice is a belief that's like really core to revolution in and of itself, which is that everybody is capable of transformation. Any force in existence can be transformed with collective effort. Anybody can be changed. Like if you believe that revolution to overthrow capitalism and build socialism is possible, then you also have to believe that anyone can change, even if they've done very, very bad harm, even if they betrayed a revolutionary struggle by aligning with the colonizer. They at least within them have the capacity for transformation. If revolution is possible, if a society transformation is possible, individual transformation has to be possible, because a society is made up of individual goddamn people. So I feel like, yeah, like one, that so many of the ideas that we think we came up with on our own are actually products of like collective struggle over a period of like centuries. That's how we like produce these things. They don't come out of nowhere. But also this core like humanistic value, like the seeing the worth in everybody, even if they caused harm, is like a deeply revolutionary thing. It's also something that has been a core part of African culture for thousands of years.
Yeah.
So I feel like that is something that we should learn from, because right now what people are calling so-called accountability is just like retribution, it's just like revenge. It's often very, 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 very abusive in and of itself. It is not focused on transformation, it's focused on punishment. And the reason why we think accountability is punishment is because of this broader society of capitalist imperialism that has taught us that that's what it is, that has taught us that some people can just be thrown away because they're not worth anything to this system. So I think that, yeah, that particular approach by Samora Machel, particularly in like the context of a war zone, they were that humanistic. Like, my God, like clearly it's possible in any kind of context, and clearly that's the kind of work that we have to do, because people don't, you know, whether it's like the kid that sold out Fred Hampton and got him killed, whether it's these Africans in Mozambique that align with the Portuguese, it's very rare that people make that kind of decision just because they suck. There are some people that suck, but oftentimes it's because they're isolated, they're backed into a corner in terms of like finances or access to resources. They have like resentments because like something happened to them and it wasn't addressed. Like very often when that kind of behavior happens, there's like an underlying cause that's because they're separated from community. I think we talked about this on the show with Sulan and Rachel a couple of months ago. Like there's always a reason that like makes people feel like that's an option. And I feel like you have to build the kind of community, build the kind of movement that like holds entire people in all their imperfections and makes it so no one's left behind and so no one's isolated, so they can't be like taken away from the group and turned against us. So yeah, maybe that sounds like squishy, like soft, but I deeply believe in the capacity for every single person to be transformed. And I feel like the example of how Samora Machel and Frelimo approach those traders is instructive in that we should follow that example and not the example of the capitalist society that teaches us to throw each other away. So yeah, anywho. So revolutionary African personality, how to be a good ancestor. So one of my favorite Fanon quotes is this: each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. As Franz Fanon, it's from The Wretched of the Earth. And what he's essentially saying in that quote is what Rashad just laid out, that every single one of us has a role to play, has a contribution to make to the collective struggle for the liberation of our people and for justice all around the world. No matter who you are, no matter what you know, no matter what your skills are, there is a lane for you. There is a role for you in a revolutionary struggle. And every single one of us has the responsibility to play the position, to find our lane and work that lane. God damn it. Like my lane's propaganda and recruitment. That's what I be doing. Also, I'm really organized, so I do that too. So that you find what you're good at and you make a contribution and you understand that you have to fight for something that's bigger than you. You have to fight for the collective liberation of your people. You can't just say, I'm going to sit and I'm going to get a good job. I'm going to make a lot of money, get a 401k, I'm going to get a job, I'm going to house, and that's my contribution. My individual success is advancing the liberation of my people. Absolutely not. You have to understand that we are either all going to get free together or we are going to be fucked. Those are the options. Either the world is going to end while everybody has a 401k, or we are going to work together and stop the end of the world and build socialism instead and build a better society where everybody has what they need. So in the APRP, we have the concept of the revolutionary African personality. It actually comes from Kwame Nkrumah. And what the revolutionary African personality is basically the idea that the process of colonization, the process of exploitation and subjugation under imperialism created like a version of African people that was created for exploitation. It was basically like they made up a straw version of us that they could better oppress and exploit. They worked to systematically destroy and denigrate our culture, our personality, and replace it with something grounded in individualism, grounded, what's it called? Oh my God. Consumerism, materialism, just like a focus on like accumulation and every man for himself, which was the opposite of who we have always been as African people. And so the revolutionary African personality is grounded in an understanding of what African culture has always been about, the qualities of collectivism, of humanism, of egalitarianism that have underlied traditional African societies for thousands of years. That is who we actually are, and that is who we have to become again in order to wage a successful struggle for the liberation of our land and of our people. If you ever heard Che Guevara talk about socialism and the man in Cuba, where he talks about the new Cuban, it's the same thing. If you've heard Ho Chi Minh talk about the new Vietnamese person, if you've heard Gabriela, the Filipino National Democratic Women's Liberation Organization, talk about the new Filipina, very, very similar concepts. It is a recognition that imperialism has created straw people to oppress, and we have to burn those straw people down and reassert our historical personality, reassert our revolutionary indigenous culture, claim what makes us us, and refuse to align with the qualities upheld by the system oppressing us. So like some concepts of the revolutionary African personality, some aspects of the revolutionary personality. Humanism. So humanism is an approach to life based on reason and on our common humanity. Humanism is a positive attitude to a world centered on human experience, thought, and hope. So the revolutionary African personality is humanistic at its core. That is why Samora Machel took that approach of focusing on the transformation of these people who had straight up betrayed him, who probably helped get his ass killed. He still was like, I see the human in you. We are going to work to transform this betrayal. We're going to work to bring you back in. That is humanism, y'all. Second aspect of the revolutionary African personality is egalitarianism, the belief that all people are equal and deserve equal rights and opportunities. Egalitarianism is in direct conflict with capitalist imperialism. Capitalist imperialism requires that some people, a minority of people, be at the top by beating down and exploiting and oppressing everybody else. Capitalism cannot exist without a permanent underclass to exploit the labor of, to steal their land, to steal their resources. So an egalitarian society cannot be a capitalist society. It must be a socialist or communist society, period. That's it. We want to build a society where all beings, not just humans, to be honest with you, because we're just big uppity animals, really. We're part of the same ecosystem as like the rest of nature. So I feel like an egalitarian society believes in the equality of all living beings, and they all deserve equal rights and opportunities, period. Collectivism is another aspect of the revolutionary African personality. Collectivism emphasizes the needs and goals of the group as a whole over the needs and desires of individuals. In short, it means not just me, but us. And that, again, is antithetical to the principles of a capitalist imperialist society. In a capitalist society, it's like every man for himself. It's like, I'm going to step on your face so I can get up to the top, so I can hustle and accumulate capital, so I can be on top of the heap. That is what a capitalist society encourages, individualism. A collectivist society says we all rise together, period. Not one person on top with everything. Well, there's like Jeff Bezos has $1 trillion and there's people sleeping in tents by the hundreds all over the United States, all over the world. Like, that's bananas. How do you have $1 trillion and see someone living in a tent and feel like you have to pay? That is the individualism spread by capitalism. The other thing that collectivism encourages is cooperation over competition. Not saying, like, I see you doing well. In a capitalist society, I'm like, fuck that guy. I want to compete with him. I want to get on top of him. I don't want him to be better than me. In a cooperative society, a collectivist society, I see someone doing well. I'm like, how can I help? Or how can I learn from them so I can do better as well? How can we work together? It is cooperation over competition. It is understanding that we are not competing in the struggle for liberation. We are fighting collectively to be free. People, we deliberately picked African revolutionaries from throughout the diaspora to represent the fact that, like Rashad said, we are fighting a global struggle for African liberation. What I see these days is that people will say, this revolutionary is better than this one, or listen to this one and not that one, or this one made more contributions than this one, so fuck this one. And I'm like, why are you doing that? Why are you doing that? Like, they made their contribution. They played their position. They worked towards the collective objective of African liberation. They weren't fighting with each other. So why are we pitting them against each other? That is, again, the reactionary individualism that is propagated against capitalist society that makes us think about just existence as a competition. Like, have you ever heard US officials talk about China, where they're like, we're in a race and we got to get on top? I'm always like, why? Why do we have to do that? Why does one have to be on top? Why can't you just work together? What the hell? Like, it's a huge planet that we're all on together. We need each other to live. We're part of an ecosystem. So why would we be competing? Why is that necessary? Why is that necessary? I fundamentally do not understand it. We are fighting for a collectivist society that is part of the revolutionary African personality. Other aspects of the revolutionary African personality include fraternity, include a commitment to justice, include a commitment to cooperation, include a respect for all forms of life, understanding that all people and living things are equal and deserve equal rights and opportunity. It's about revolutionary internationalism and solidarity. It's also about humility. So those are all aspects of the revolutionary African personality laid out by Kwame Nkrumah. It is part of what the work study process of the All African People's Revolutionary Party is meant to develop in people. We are developing cadre. We are developing new African people that can wage the revolutionary struggle for our land, for our lives, to liberate us, to liberate all people across the world. So that is what we think it takes to be a good ancestor. And I believe that all the folks that we talked about today embody those aspects of the revolutionary African personality. And what we are trying to do in the APRP is live up to that example. And the last thing that I'll say before we move on to World Geo is that these people were not superheroes. They are remarkable people. They are brilliant people. They are dedicated fighters for the African Revolution. But you must understand, they were human beings. They were just regular people who found their lane, who played their position, who made their contribution. So like Safiya Bukhari, Walter Rodney, Kwame Nkrumah, Frantz Fanon, Winnie Mandela, don't think of them as like better than you or like above you. Because like I said, we're collectivists, we're not individualists, we cooperate, we're not in competition. Understand that you can be like them if you decide to make your contribution, to commit yourself to a struggle to liberate your people, to act collectively in a revolutionary political organization. People always gush about Kwame Ture, like what a principled revolutionary he was, what a great public speaker he was, how clear his analysis was. Kwame Ture was the product of participation in revolutionary organizations for the entirety of his life. He got that clarity, that those public speaking skills, that charisma from his participation in collective struggle. So you can be Kwame Ture, you can be Winnie Mandela, you can be Frantz Fanon, you can be Walter Rodney. You just have to find your position and play it and contribute to collective struggle. Do not think of these people as above you. Think of them as a model to live up to. And this is actually also how Cuban people talk about Fidel Castro when you talk to them. So yeah, that's it. That's all I want to say. So yeah, I'll pass it to Rashad.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, actually, we we need everyone to. Well, we need thousands of us to be Winnie Mandela's and Safiya Bakari's and Walter Rodney's and stuff. We need more. We can't just have one of these motherfuckers, one of us, getting there and stuff like that, or being this leader. We need thousands of leaders and thousands of people who are like in undyingly dedicated to liberation. And so yeah. Yeah, so I'll say that. So yeah, that's end of that. So we'll get to World Geo now, and so first, I guess we'll talk about something that's like really unfortunate, and that has been for like it just gets under my skin, obviously. But there was a journalist in Palestine who was murdered, Irene. I can't remember her last name, and I'm sorry. She was murdered by the Israeli Defense Forces, and I think it was 2 days ago. And so, and also a 16-year-old boy was also murdered. And so, we want to talk about the fact that we obviously know Israel is an apartheid state, and I put that state in quotes, not apartheid. The state fact. It's an apartheid state. It's a genocidal state, and they are executing Palestinians, children, journalists, families. They're demolishing Okay, yes, thank you, Big Till. Shireen Abu Akleh, if I said that right. I hope so. Um, and so, yeah, like we understand, like we just want to make it known that Zionism, which is the political ideology that governs the state, quote unquote, of Israel, it's a racist ideology. It's not a religion. It should not ever be connected to Judaism, as the state tries to intertwine them and make them one and the same. Um, and so yeah, we just want to highlight the fact that the Palestinians have been going through this forced annihilation, this forced um, subjugation of their land and theft of their land for decades. The Nakba happened in 1948, and so that was like the not even the beginning, but the first one of the first main instances of where Palestinians were forced in exile or to leave their homelands that they've been there for thousands of years. And so these acts of aggression and literal terrorism, state and terrorism, is continued for decades. And the Palestinian people, like big ups to them because they they have never they use that shit in a way that's like extremely inspiring because they use that to continue the struggle, and they understand that there is no compromise, there is no stop until victory is won. And so yeah, I'm really sad about the losses the Palestinians have been suffered. There's been multiple children. They say 10 in 2022, 10 children, 10 Palestinian children murdered by the Israeli Defense Forces just in 2022. But I swear I've seen more. But um, at the very least, we know that this isn't an anomaly. Them killing journalists, multiple journalists have been murdered for over the years. They're in the business of killing children and destroying families, destroying homes, and so yeah, that's unfortunate. And yeah, so yeah, we just gonna always recognize and highlight the Palestinian struggle for liberation, and understand that we are in the same struggle as them as colonized people. And shit, man, we gotta like fucking help because, especially here, those of us in the West, those of us who are colonized and know that we're colonized, we got to start stepping up and being able to help and like fucking have our international reach. And I know like obviously some groups are able to do it, but we just need it to be more because they need help. They're able to. I mean, obviously they're sustaining and they're gonna, they're gonna win regardless. But at the same time, we can fucking, get in there with some nudges, man, and help and not allow our taxes to go to fund the murder of Palestinians and to fund the expansion of the Israeli state at the expense of Palestinian homes and communities that have been there for thousands, hundreds of years. It's ridiculous. And so, yeah, free Palestine forever, because free Palestine forever, because they represent like one of the most inspiring and principled struggles for liberation um, from the 20th century into obviously right now the 21st century. And so yeah, settler colonialism is a bitch, and it has to be destroyed. And Zionism is right along there, fucking hands tied with colonialism and imperialism. And so these are forces that must be destroyed. And yeah.
Also, in Burkina right now, there are 8 African miners that were trapped in a Canadian-owned mine, the Pacora mine in Ouagadougou. They've been trapped there actually for, I believe, over a month, and it's just now hitting the news in the West. The mine is owned by the Canadian-based corporation, Trevela Mining Corp. It's a zinc mine. And so you actually read about this in work study, and it was really revealing what we learned when we looked a little bit deeper into it. So first of all, I muted myself. The Canadian mine, African nation, the workers in that mine regularly experience accidents because of unsafe working conditions. The collapse that trapped these 8 miners was actually caused by an illegal demolition that collapsed a part of the structure and got them in there. The government of Burkina Faso has correctly said that the owners of this Canadian mine are not allowed to leave the country until those miners are rescued. So that's great. But one thing to understand is that for some reason, Canada has this like reputation of being like a kinder, gentler, like Western capitalist nation. But Canada has been extracting and stealing resources across Africa, across Central and South America for a very, very long time. Canada itself was only built on land that they violently stole from indigenous people. So it's like a complete myth that Canada is like a kinder, gentler imperialist power. The other thing that's really interesting is that when these new mines open up, it's often sold in the Western media as like an opportunity for the African people living in the region where the extraction is happening. They talk about like jobs, they talk about like income coming in. The jobs are shitty. They get paid very low wages compared to in extractivist industries outside of the global south. And when these mines are opened up, oftentimes what happens is that they are drilling into places where people are living and farming and working already. So what we read about this before mine and Ouagadougou is that people were engaged in subsistence farming as well as artisanal mining, which is like small, much small scale mining. It doesn't have as much a big environmental impact. And when this mine was dug, they moved all those people against their will away from this land that they had been farming on for generations. And now those people can not only not get jobs in the mine, but they are also not able to get access to the land they need to grow their food. So what that mine, and this is every time you hear about a mine opening up in Africa, in Central and South America opening up, like think about this. What that mine actually did was like displace an entire community and also destroy the land and water that community was previously using to survive. And now on top of that, they're mining the African workers in that mine are extremely exploited. They get slave wages. The resources that are mined are just immediately shipped overseas, and the people living in Burkina Faso see no profit. And on top of that, they're extremely unsafe working conditions. And now 8 Africans are trapped underground and have been for over a month. And so this is not like a new or unique thing in Africa. It's happening all over the continent. US, African, Israeli corporations extracting, looting from the land, displacing people, poisoning the water. In work study, I shared the story of the first time I went to Ghana with the APRP on our delegation from the Oregon chapter. We went to Nkroful, which is the small village where Kwame Nkrumah was born. There's like a museum that's about his life in the village. And there's also an illegal Australian mining operation. They're digging for gold at the main water source of that village. So like upstream, you'll see heavy machinery and workers extracting from the land. And just a few miles downstream, you'll see people washing their clothes. You'll see kids swimming. You'll see people collecting water so they can cook. The water is poisoned with chemicals from the mining operation. And when I say it's an illegal mining operation, I mean this Australian corporation literally like posted up in this land. They didn't even get a permit from the neocolonial Ghanaian government. They just posted up on this land and started digging years ago and started poisoning the water with no permission whatsoever. They didn't ask the people that live there. They didn't ask the government. It's been years and there's nothing that people living there can do and the government's taking no action. And the main water supply is being poisoned. This is happening all over the continent where these US corporations, these Western corporations, these Canadian corporations are destroying the land, destroying the water, extracting the resources, exploiting African workers, and giving nothing back. So every time you use your phone, every time you use your car, your tablet, your laptop, any kind of electronic device, every time you drive your car, the wheels on your car, think about all of the resources that are being extracted from Africa under precisely these conditions, in illegal mining operations, in straight up plantations like it is for cocoa and rubber. This is the situation on the continent. This is what Walter Rodney was talking about in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. This is the reality of the African continent. It's also the reality of indigenous people all over the world. Like where I'm from, my family's from Honduras, Canadian tourism companies bought up all the beachfront property and now they shoot at African teenagers if they trespass at these hotels. So this is a global phenomenon where Western capitalist nations go to the global south and loot and terrorize and exploit. And so the mining accident that's unfolding in Burkina Faso is just the latest example of capitalist exploitation of Africa in the global south. That is why the APRP says repeatedly and consistently that this entire economic system is based on the exploitation of Africa, because it could not function without this looting and theft and destruction and exploitation of African people. These countries would not be wealthy. They would not be superpowers without this destruction in Africa and throughout the global south, period. So it's part of the crisis in Burkina Faso, which again we just learned about in the West, because when Nazis in Ukraine need a platform, the Western media obliges. When African and exploited people suffer the consequences of Western capitalist extractivism, but they keep it under wraps, so we don't know about it. I just happened to find out about it from Twitter. But yeah, it's part of a larger global phenomenon. What else is happening in the world, Rashad?
That's hard. So I guess we'll talk about Russia and Ukraine. And so we understand, well, if you're paying attention to even to, I guess, mainstream media sometimes, and you have like a critical lens, you understand that Russia is winning the war, the mission, the operation in Ukraine, and that we just keep sending aid to Ukraine, the West specifically. We'll talk about obviously the U.S. And so I don't know the total. I know we just sent another 40 billion. There was like 33 billion like a couple weeks ago, and then there was like 18 billion a couple weeks before that. And this is like has been an ongoing thing that we've been doing since like 2014 anyway. So like we understand that we keep sending them aid for a losing effort because they're not going to win. And so at the expense, we're sending them aid. And I think in one of the aid packages to Ukraine that we sent, they literally, yeah, not we, exactly. So one of the aid packages that America sent to Ukraine, definitely, literally, they just took it off of like a COVID relief bill for us here, and they just was like, here, fuck it, it's better suited over there. And so we see Nancy Pelosi fucking talking bullshit, saying that if we're questioning why we're sending money to Ukraine, just ask yourself what some biblical verse of Matthew 10:2 or something like that. And it's just ridiculous that they're literally playing games with us right now, like constantly. That's all they do is just play games and talk bullshit. And so you can sit up here and they can have like be legitimately serious and get up there and talk to American people and say the reason why you don't have baby formula, why pregnant women don't have baby formula, while we're like trying to repeal Roe versus Wade, is because Matthew 2 says, give and you shall receive, or some nonsense. It's just ridiculous how they're able to say whatever the fuck they want and literally just take the things that could be used for those of us in this country and just give it to Nazis, neo-Nazis in a whole different country across the whole world. And so, so yeah, it's just crazy. So we know that they're sending aid and that Russia is winning, and it has obviously it's affecting us because like I just talked about, the baby formula for pregnant women or for women who have just given birth. It's extremely hard to find in stores, if not like completely out of stock. And so that we obviously know that that's an issue. We know that food prices are insane. Gas prices have literally not went down. It's like $4 here in Denver, which is usually like a decent spot for gas, kind of. $4 is like crazy. People in California, New York, and over there, they're like, bro, that's normal. But yeah, food prices, gas prices are going up here. And more intensely, the effect is being felt in, so-called third world nations, and specifically the continent, Africa and the continent. And and so the shortages of sanctions aren't the sanctions that that the US and the EU are applying on Russia. It's not really affecting them, bro, because they were prepared for this. They knew what the fuck was going to happen, and they were prepared to decouple from Western imperialist powers and the hold they have on global trade. They were prepared for that shit. African countries and the neo-colonial governments that they have in their dependence, their forced dependence, as Walter Rodney would say, their forced dependence forced dependence on the West for food, or even from Russia, forced dependence on other nations for food and wheat and things that they need to eat, like bread and stuff like that. That's affecting people on the continent in third world nations. The sanctions aren't affecting Russia, and part of me feels like the government knows that. They know that. For one, it's obviously like fucking just the sanctions are just performative in general anyway. But I think they know that eventually it goes and it hurts other nations in the periphery, specifically on the continent of Africa, and they're fine with that because for one, it might entice the neo-colonial African governments that have tried to abstain from the fight between the West and Russia, who tried to abstain. They know that trying to force them into adopting the same measures and sanctioning Russia will be, that's to me their goal. They don't care about if, regular African children are starving from the sanctions they're putting on a fucking country that has nothing to do with Africa. And so, it's unfortunate that we're, our tax dollars, everything that we work we're literally working. Like I'm working. I think about it all the time. It's really pissing me off. Like I'm working and my money is literally going to Nazis in Ukraine. I know it. Like I know it for a fact. I've seen them, bro. We all seen the Nazis there. And so my money's going for them. My money is going to kill Palestinians and stuff. It's just ridiculous. And so they're able to get away with it because of our lack of organization and our lack of even the organizations we have who do good work and stuff like that. We understand that it's not enough in the moment in time. And so we're gonna need organization to be able to like start to meet our own needs. I don't know how the fuck we're gonna get baby formula. I don't know how that would even be possible. I'm not like, I don't know about that. But at the same time, we have to get organized to start sorting these things out and to actually fight back and demand that our money be used for us something, because it just at the moment in time we're literally being robbed right in front of our face, and like they're funding Nazis like they've been doing for decades, and so it's unfortunate. Big Till said in the chat that he heard inflation has reached like 400% in places like Sudan. And that shit is, that's unacceptable. It's unacceptable. And fucking, we know that that's what the West is funding, losing effort in Ukraine. And so, yeah, I guess I'll conclude with that as bullshit.
Yeah, and then someone asked in the chat, I'll put on the screen, can the baby formula shortage be thought of as a class issue since it's poor and working class people who are mostly impacted? And absolutely yes. Like, do you know what the origin of the baby food shortage is? Have you read about this, Rashad?
I don't think so.
So what happens is that the domestic supply of baby formula is controlled by a handful of corporations. I believe there's like 4 of them. And we just read about the tendency of capitalism towards monopoly because we just finished The Highest Age of Imperialism by Lenin. So I read that and I was like, huh. So one of the main suppliers of baby formula in the United States is Abbott Nutrition Brands. Abbott Nutrition Brands earlier this year had several plants that were manufacturing baby formula shut down by the FDA. And the reason why that happened is because over a year ago, an employee at the Abbott Nutrition Brands plant was like, the conditions that y'all are manufacturing this formula in are disgusting. They're going to get people sick. And actually, 4 infants died after that whistleblower put it out there from bacterial infections they got from that formula manufactured in those plants. So the FDA, a year motherfucking later, after babies had already died, shut down the plant. That plant was one of the main manufacturers of baby formula in the United States. That is what created the shortage on top of the already existing supply chain issues that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. That's what it was. The other thing was that Abbott Nutrition Brands operated during the pandemic in extremely unsafe ways. They got many, many, many employees on the lines in those plants sick because they refused to shut down. Then they fired them before they could get access to any kind of healthcare. So all up and through this, did you ever read The Jungle by Upton Sinclair in school? That was like one of the best things we read in school. It was good,
I've never
but
read
it's
that book.
basically about during the Industrial Revolution, how the conditions in the manufacturing industry were like barbaric, like people were like really getting maimed. There was like human body parts in the canned goods because the factories were so unsafe. How like the workers were exploited. How there was like child labor. It basically like when it came out, it like busted wide open the barbarism of this industry and forced like a number of reforms. Clearly, we have regressed, but that's what it made me think about. It made me think about the tendency of late stage capitalism towards monopoly that we are seeing right now, which is why the domestic supply for this extremely necessary item is controlled by a handful of corporations, which means when one is taken out, it's going to have a vast impact on everybody's access to baby formula. But also made me think about the jungle and the conditions in these factories, because the priority of the ruling class is not making baby formula without deadly bacteria in it. It's not making sure their workers don't get COVID and die. It is simply prioritizing making as much profit as possible for as little cost. So this is the consequence. Like, this was not a natural occurrence or an accident. It was literally a corporation that has a monopoly alongside three other ones over this particular necessity, acting a fool, acting a mess, prioritizing profits, and risking the lives of children and workers. So it is absolutely a class issue. Most things are. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good. I just want to say real quick, I work in like production like that, making like food stuff and drinks. I've done, I've worked for companies making beer, water, and so yeah, I just want everyone to know that like everything from like pop to water, it's just the machines that we use, man. I just want to let you guys know there is so much fucking dirt and like just disgusting shit that comes from when like the water we used to make gallon jugs for water. The shit that these bottles come from is so disgusting. And it's like, it's not even on the workers. Like there's no way to clean it. Like if you clean it in 5 minutes, it's dirty again. And like, you're never get down into, it's just disgusting. So I want everyone to understand that. It's everything that we make from these machines is like, literally, it's disgusting. And so, yeah, there you go.
Yeah. I used to work fast food, and I'm surprised people eat that shit, because the things I saw, yeah, mass production under capitalism is gross. It's gross. Most of the things that we consume are made under disgusting conditions, and it's really a shock that these things don't happen much more often. So in any case, that's what's up with the baby food shortage, as well as some other things going on in the world. Now let's talk about what's going on with this ongoing global COVID-19 pandemic. It's not over. Far from over. We are still years away from it being over, but any kind of organized public health response in the United States has been abandoned. So earlier this week, the Biden administration put out a warning, like one of the strongest warnings they have put out since Biden got in there, saying that they are anticipating 100 million people in the United States will be infected by COVID by the fall, unless there is additional COVID funding designated by Congress. And what in that 100 million, they mean if you already got COVID, you're still in that number. If you've been vaccinated and boosted, you are still in that number. For some reason, there's like a lot of people that believe that if you get COVID one time, you won't get it again. No, people are getting it 2 times, 3 times, 4 times. Baby, we're not safe. We are not safe. I am vaccinated and boosted. I am at risk too. In fact, a study just came out from the UK looking at the Omicron and Delta waves that found 9.1% of infections that led to long COVID, the debilitating long-ass version of COVID-19, occurred among people who had gotten both vaccine shots and a booster. So the booster is already waning in effectiveness. And at this point, 9.1 of the people getting long COVID, which is millions of people, are vaxxed and boosted. So understand, doesn't matter if you got it before, doesn't matter if you're vaccinated, doesn't matter if you're vaccinated and boosted, you are not safe. You are in that 100 million. And the same week at that Biden administration statement came out, like Rashad said, they passed that new funding bill for Ukraine, that $30 billion that is going to Nazis in Ukraine. And initially in that bill, there was additional funding for the pandemic response in the United States. Senate leaders indicated, both Democrats and Republicans indicated to the Biden administration that it was likely to delay the bill if that funding was kept in there because Republicans are against it. Biden was like, okay, pass the Ukraine money by itself. We'll worry about the COVID money later. He said that after his own administration put out that statement saying 100 million of y'all are about to catch COVID by fall. Good Lord. And way back in March, like the money that they're talking about now is to replace the money that ended way back in March. At the end of March, all of the federal funding that was providing free testing and medical care for people living in the United States without insurance ran out. It ran out in March, which is why if you do not have insurance and you try to get a COVID test in a lot of places, you're paying $100 to $200 because the federal funding to cover that ran out. If you get COVID and go to the hospital and you don't have insurance, you are going to be paying thousands of dollars because the federal funding ran out 2 months ago. So the COVID funding that was taken out of that Ukraine spending bill, that was that money, y'all. There's still no federal coverage for uninsured people, for COVID tests, or for vaccines. This is the situation. Also, there are new variants emerging across the world. There's like BA2, BA3, BA4, BA6. They're popping up all over the place because, like was said, I remember this being said like 6 months into the pandemic, where even if a vaccine was developed, if the majority of the population was not vaccinated, and if there was no access to healthcare, the virus would continue to spread out of control and generate new variants indefinitely. So that's what we're currently living through. The majority, I think it's like 60% of the US population has 2 shots. There's like a minority that's boosted and everybody else has nothing. And so it's just spreading out of control between unvaccinated and vaccinated people, and there's no national health care. So it's going to keep mutating. It's just going to keep going. There's going to be more variants. They're not going to be mild. A study that just came out that said Omicron was never more mild than any other COVID variant. They were saying Omicron was mild for like 6 months. It wasn't true. It was as deadly as Delta. It actually killed more people than Delta. Omicron was never mild. So yeah. So now we are also experiencing extremely high community transmission rates across the United States. It is the hidden wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. And what I mean by it's hidden is that if you go to the CDC maps about community transmission, you will see the data is a week old. You will see the maps that they are presenting first and foremost show a sea of green as if to say that the risk of COVID is low. That is not true. Community transmission is extremely high across the entire United States. We are in a wave that was deliberately hidden. This administration decided that they wanted to make people not be scared about COVID, so the Democrats could win the raggedy ass midterms. And so they were like, we're going to pretend it's over. We're going to fuss with the data to make it look better than it is. We're going to hope that y'all just forget about it. But now we're getting mollywopped. Now people are getting sick, very, very sick, even if they're vaccinated and boosted. Good Lord. The other thing that's happening, many new variants emerging, out of control spread. Oh yeah. So like I said, the consequence of out of control spread of this virus among an only partially vaccinated population with many people that have no access to healthcare is the emergence of many, many, many new variants. That's what we're seeing. The other thing, and the other part that's contributing to that is the vaccine apartheid that we talked about in the show quite a few times, where the first world capitalist nations hoarded the global supply of the vaccine, refused to release patents on the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, which made it so global South countries could not produce their own generic versions of the vaccine. They were forced to buy it. They could not afford it. And so now the first world nations have much higher vaccination rates than most of the global South. China, Russia, Cuba are working to mitigate that, are sharing their vaccine supplies, are engaging in medical solidarity, but that is still the case. Like, that is the reality on the ground. The selfishness and greed of the capitalist countries has created a situation where there are millions of people around the world who do not have access to vaccines. And if you work in the service or food industry, the situation is dire because all the lockdowns are over. The mask mandate was dropped. The CDC mask mandate was dropped, which led to even blue states dropping their mask mandates. New Mexico held on for like a long time, and the federal mask mandate was dropped, and New Mexico dropped it, and then the next wave, the hidden wave, hit. My God. So if you work in like a restaurant, if you work in a retail store, if you work in fast food, you are basically encountering a situation where you may personally be wearing a mask, but you are forced to engage on a day-to-day basis with people who are not wearing masks because they were told they don't have to. And what's happening is what's been happening since the beginning of the pandemic. The so-called essential workers that everybody was like performatively celebrating are getting wrecked. They're getting sick. They're getting COVID over and over and over again, even if they're vaccinated. And these jobs do not provide good benefits. They do not provide health care, which means these people have no choice but to keep working, but to pay their rent. Then they get sick on the job and they can't even get medical treatment. Some of them are getting long COVID or are permanently disabled. It is a monstrous situation deliberately created by the ruling class of this country and continued in policy by the Biden administration. I've said it before. I will say it again. The Trump administration handled COVID better. Maybe it's just that it was like new and they were like, oh, let's just do the right thing because they were on the party line yet. But the fact of the matter is that all of the COVID protections that were in place under Trump were wiped away under Biden, and the Biden administration has made it clear that they have no intention of putting that back in place. This was supposed to be the lesser evil. Clearly it was not. So some things that we should do, certainly encourage folks to get vaccinated, get boosted. If you have not done so, get that 4th shot if you are high risk and eligible. But understand, the more this shit spreads, the more new variants emerge because of the failed public health response, the less protection that is going to provide. And the boosters themselves only provide an additional 6 months of protection. So it's really only so much you can do. In an ideal world, the vaccine would have allowed them to buy time for a coherent public health response. But instead, they attempted to use the vaccine as a magic bullet. And as we are seeing right now, magic bullets are not real. So by all means, get vaccinated, get boosted, get your 4th shot, but understand you are still probably going to catch COVID at this point. Also, now is the time. Now is the time to buy masks before the inevitable shortages that are coming later this year. Like I guarantee you, when it gets really real in the fall and winter, we are going to struggle to buy masks. N95 masks are what is required now. Like the cloth mask is not going to do it. If that's all you have, by all means, like keep wearing that. It's better than nothing, but we need N95s and N99s. I get mine in bulk from this website called wellbefore.com. Please check them out. You can get like an order of like 100, 200, get it for your whole block. That's what I did. So at this point, an N95 is what you should be going for, and check out Well Before for bulk orders. Also, this is just, I do not go inside with other people maskless. I would encourage you not to do that if you can at all help it. Like just hang out outside with your friends wearing a mask is what I do. But of course, if you are a so-called essential worker, a service industry worker, a fast food worker, you don't have a fucking choice. So overall, what we need to do is get organized. We need to build a movement that is powerful, organized, and militant enough to demand the public health response that's going to save people's lives. Again, we are looking at years, additional years of COVID-19. This will not be over for years. It's not going to be a few more months. It's going to be years. So we are like the ruling class, the people in power have already made it clear how it's going to go. They're going to leave us to die. And so if you would like to not die, then you should join an organization fighting for justice and build that militant mass movement that is powerful enough to demand a coherent public health response and win it. Also, on an individual level, on a personal level, on a local level, spread the word to your community about the hidden wave. People do not know what's happening because the US media aligned with the Biden administration to hide what is going on. People are just noticing a lot of folks getting sick. They're getting sick. But like, if you look at what's happening on the news, it's like a completely different reality. So like, tell your friends and family, it is not over. We still need masks. We still need to be very, very careful. There's a hidden wave unfolding. Tell your friends, help them get the supplies they need. And we have to think about how we can organize projects of medical solidarity in our communities, projects of community defense in response to this pandemic. We got to stop waiting for the people in power to do right by us, because they are clearly not going to. They are clearly not going to. So the New Mexico chapter, or the Southwest chapter of the APRP here in Tiwa territory, we initiated an elder care program where we're delivering supplies of masks, of medicine, of food to elders in our community, because we were like, you are very high risk. It's not safe for you to go out, so we're going to bring what you need to your door. So things like that, like how can we organize and make sure that there are supplies of baby formula, that there are supplies of masks, that there are supplies of COVID tests. Albuquerque Mutual Aid, with no experience, formed a program that has fed tens of thousands of people in Tiwa territory with just like 30 people contributing labor. So it shows you that with organization, we can meet people's needs. And that is what's needed at this particular time. So join an organization, fighting for justice, start to build projects of medical solidarity and community defense, start to connect those projects locally and regionally, and let's help build the infrastructure we need to survive this ongoing pandemic. First step though, join an organization, period. So let's move on to the closing. It's been over 2 hours, Jesus Christ. Okay, so next show, Thursday, May 26th, 1 p.m. Mountain Time. Please join us. Same place, same time, every channel where you're watching this, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, YouTube, that's where you can watch the show on Thursday, May 26th at 1 p.m. So we hope to see you there. Also, this coming Saturday is the May edition of the Pan-African Film Series. We're going to be showing the Senegalese film Zala, which is about a neo-colonial man who's attempting to straddle selling out to Western imperialism alongside upholding traditional African culture, and how that works out for him. It's a spoiler. It's not well. It doesn't work out well. So if you want to see that movie, it's pretty good. It's like a comedy. Join us Saturday, 2 p.m. Mountain Time. All the channels where you're watching the show right now, you can watch that movie with us. We'll be screening it and discussing it. It's going to be myself and Monica. Also, this Sunday, May 15th at 5 p.m. here in Tiwa territory, we're having the spring reopening of the Pan-African Community Garden. It's going to be very cute. We're going to be having some political education about patriarchy, because man, good Lord, it's making a comeback in these times. So we're going to be talking about patriarchy. We're also going to be engaging in some cleaning up from the last season. We're going to be planting some seedlings. We're going to be building some beds. It's going to be we're going to be out there grilling if you're hungry. So please come through. Avenida Cesar Chavez and Arno in Albuquerque, 5 p.m. Mountain Time. We hope to see you there. And then on Tuesday, May 24th and Wednesday, May 25th, the All African People's Revolutionary Party is hosting our 2-day African Liberation Day 2022 webinar. Please join us on Tuesday, May 24th, starting at 5 p.m. UTC for a series of 3 panel discussions all around the theme of smashing neocolonialism. And then on Wednesday, May 25th, join us at 5 p.m. UTC for a live stream of the African Liberation Day March and Rally from the PIGC in Guinea-Bissau. We be talking about the PIGC all the time on this show. We greatly admire them. They're actually a part of the APRP. You get to see them live in person Wednesday, May 25th. Go see what all the fuss is about. So please register for African Liberation Day at the link on the screen, bit.ly/smash neocolonialism. It is completely free. You will learn a lot. You'll be inspired to fight. You'll be inspired to join the organization. So please come through. And then also, lastly, we are actively soliciting donations for our community defense projects, including the Elder Care Program, including the Pan-African Community Garden. So if you want to support the work of the All African People's Revolutionary Party in the Southwest U.S., you can Venmo us at APRP-New Mexico-NM. Or if you're in Tiwa territory and you got like compost, dirt, scrap wood, plants, gloves, a wheelbarrow, we desperately need a wheelbarrow, please come by the garden at Avenida Cesar Chavez and Arno and drop off whatever supplies you have to share. We will be very, very, very grateful. So that concludes this edition of Weekly Pan-African News. We want to thank you so much for joining us, for your contributions, for always being so lively in the chat. Y'all are hilarious. Thank you so much. We will see you on Saturday for the Pan-African Film Series. Stay ready for revolution and have a great rest of your day.